Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When a quiet Vermont cabin owner is threatened with demolition by a powerful HOA claiming his home sits on their land, he uncovers a web of deceit, doctored maps, and corporate overreach. What began as a boundary dispute turns into a courtroom reckoning no one saw coming. I've always liked places that don't pretend to be something else. My grandfather's land in the Vermont mountains was like that. Quiet, uneven, honest. 2.3 acres of sloping forest, granite outcrops, and a narrow clearing where he built the summer cottage back in 1972. No grand design, no ego. Just a solid structure on properly surveyed ground, tied to a parcel registered long before anyone thought of branding nature with words like exclusive community. I inherited the land years ago, but only last year did I finally have the time and money to restore the cottage properly. New drainage so spring runoff wouldn't chew at the foundation, reinforced footings, updated insulation, and solar panels angled just right to catch the morning sun through the trees. Every permit was pulled through the county. Every inspection signed off. I'm a landscape architect. I don't gamble with land, and I definitely don't build blind. Until recently, the nearest neighbors were deer, and the occasional black bear that minded its own business better than most people do. That changed when Aspen Creek Ridge started expanding uphill. Big houses, identical stone facades, private security patrols, and an HOA that loved the sound of its own authority. Still, they stayed on their side, and I stayed on mine, or so I thought. It was a hot July afternoon when a dark SUV rolled up my gravel drive without asking. Two men stepped out first, both wearing crisp jackets with the HOA logo stitched like a badge. Behind them came a woman in sunglasses holding a thick folder under one arm and a metal tape measure in the other. She didn't introduce herself at first, just scanned my cottage like a building inspector shopping for problems. "I'm Karen Chelsea Morton," she finally said, pulling the sunglasses down just enough to look over them. "President of Aspen Creek Ridge." That explained the posture. The two men fanned out immediately, one of them extending the tape measure toward the southwest corner of my cottage, as if this was already settled. "Hold it," I said, stepping between him and the wall. "You're not measuring anything on my property." Karen smiled like she'd practiced it in a mirror. "This won't take long. According to our updated boundary assessment, part of your structure encroaches onto land owned by the Aspen Creek Ridge Homeowners Association." I actually laughed, not loudly, just enough to make it clear I thought she was joking. When she didn't smile back, I reached for the folder I keep in the mudroom. Deed, county plat map, boundary coordinates, survey markers. I laid them out on the porch railing, one by one. "My land ends here," I said, tapping the map. "Your association's land ends 15 yards short of that tree line. Always has." Karen didn't even look. She opened her own folder and produced a glossy printout, a digital cadastral map with a thick red line shoved several feet into my parcel. My cottage, conveniently, sat just across it. "This is the corrected version," she said. Older surveys were inaccurate. "Land boundaries don't get corrected with a color printer," I replied. "And they definitely don't move because your neighborhood doesn't like the view." Her jaw tightened. "You can refuse to cooperate if you want, but the association will seek a court order. Partial demolition is usually the fastest solution." That was the moment it stopped being absurd and became hostile. I gathered my papers calmly, meeting her stare. "You don't get to redraw Vermont," I said. "This cottage stands on land my family owned before Aspen Creek Ridge existed on paper. If you think otherwise, you're welcome to try proving it somewhere that isn't my porch." Karen nodded once, sharp and controlled, already done with the conversation. She signaled to her people, and they walked back to the SUV without another word. As it drove away, I looked down at the corner of the cottage they'd been so interested in. Solid, square, exactly where it had been for over 50 years. Someone apparently had decided that was a problem. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail like a warning shot. I knew what it was before I opened it. Thick envelope, legal formatting, the Aspen Creek Ridge logo stamped at the top like a seal of authority. HOA letters always look the same, polite on the surface, aggressive between the lines. According to the notice, the association had completed a revised boundary assessment and determined that my cottage encroached onto their land by approximately 4 feet along the southwest wall. 4 feet. A number just big enough to sound precise and just small enough to seem harmless. They were willing to resolve the matter amicably, provided I agreed to remove the affected portion of the structure, relocate my fence, and compensate the HOA for unauthorized land use. The proposed figure was $87,000, listed as if it were a utility bill I'd simply forgotten to pay. Attached was the same digital map Karen had waved around on my porch, now labeled as an official exhibit. At the bottom sat a signature block from a licensed engineer named Ben Foster. I didn't recognize the name, which already bothered me. Vermont is small in professional circles. You don't work with land long without running into the same surveyors and engineers. I didn't respond emotionally. I never do. I pulled my original documents again, checked the county registry numbers, and then looked up Ben Foster. It took less than 10 minutes to find what the HOA probably hoped I wouldn't. 2 prior disciplinary actions, both involving methodological inaccuracies in boundary certifications across state lines. One had been settled quietly. The other ended with a temporary suspension, not revoked, but close enough to smell. I drafted a formal response that same evening. No insults, no sarcasm, just facts. I stated clearly that my property boundaries were legally established, that the cottage predated Aspen Creek Ridge by decades, and that any claim of encroachment was unsupported by county records. I attached copies of my deed, the archived plat map, and the GPS coordinates from the most recent inspection. Then I sent it certified, return receipt requested, and went back to work like the matter was closed. It wasn't. A week later, the sheriff's deputy knocked on my door. Not aggressive, not rude, just procedural. He handed me a court summons filed by Aspen Creek Ridge Homeowners Association. They weren't asking any more. They were demanding judicial enforcement. Demolition of the encroaching portion of my cottage, removal of my fence, financial damages, and, tucked neatly into the filing, a request to place my property under HOA jurisdiction pending resolution. That last part was the tell. This was never about 4 feet of land. This was about control. I read the filing twice, slowly. They claim my documents were outdated. They claim the revised digital survey superseded historical records. They even implied my renovation work had altered the original footprint of the cottage. A quiet accusation, but a serious one. I didn't panic. I didn't call Karen. I didn't argue with the deputy. I thanked him, closed the door, and sat at my kitchen table until the anger cooled into something more useful. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move, designed to overwhelm me with procedure and cost until giving in looked cheaper than fighting back. They had underestimated one thing. I design landscapes for a living. I know how ground tells the truth, even when people lie about it, and I knew enough to understand that if they were willing to fabricate boundaries, they wouldn't stop unless someone pushed back harder than they expected. So I didn't treat the summons as a threat. I treated it as permission. The next morning, I didn't waste time pretending this was still a neighbor dispute. I called a property litigation firm in Montpelier that specialized in land boundary conflicts, the kind that usually start politely and end with judges getting very tired of liars. By noon, I was sitting across from my attorney, a woman who listened without interrupting and asked questions that went straight to the spine of the problem. When I finished, she didn't look surprised. She looked annoyed, which I took as a good sign. Her first question wasn't about the HOA. It was about the land itself. When was it first surveyed? Where were the original markers? Had anything ever been moved, replaced, or updated without a county filing? I answered calmly because I already knew the answers. My grandfather had been meticulous. The original boundary survey from the late 1950s wasn't just archived, it was referenced in every subsequent transfer. Concrete markers still existed along the western line, half buried and ignored by anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. Within an hour, she agreed to represent me and suggested what I'd already been thinking. We weren't going to rely on one expert. We were going to make it impossible for Aspen Creek Ridge to pretend this was a gray area. I hired 2 independent licensed surveyors from different firms, both with long histories in Vermont land disputes. They worked separately, unaware of each other's findings, and both started from the same place: archival records, county plats, and physical boundary evidence on the ground. I didn't hover while they worked. I didn't interfere. I let professionals do what they do best when no one is whispering in their ear. While they measured, mapped, and cross-referenced, I dug into Aspen Creek Ridge's own purchase history. HOAs love to pretend their land is older than it is, but developers leave paper trails. Buried in a recorded transaction from years ago was the original acquisition document for the HOA's western boundary. Clear language, no ambiguity. Their land stopped well short of mine, by more than a dozen feet, not 4. When the surveyors delivered their reports, they didn't match the HOA's map even remotely. Both confirmed the same thing. My cottage sat precisely where it always had, inside my legal boundary. The discrepancy wasn't minor. The HOA's digital map had shifted the line inward by over 12 feet. That wasn't drift, that was design. My attorney reviewed everything and leaned back in her chair. "This isn't an error," she said. "This is an attempt." We filed a counterclaim the same week. $250,000. Defamation, attempted deprivation of property rights, fabrication of topographical data, legal harassment, no dramatic language, just clean accusations supported by evidence. We attached both independent surveys, the archival plan from 1958, and the HOA's own purchase document contradicting their claim. The response from Aspen Creek Ridge was immediate and defensive. Their lawyers suggested mediation. Then they suggested delays. Then they suggested that perhaps both parties had valid interpretations. I declined all of it, not angrily, professionally. I wasn't interested in compromise, not when the facts were this clear. They hadn't misread the land. They had tried to move it. Aspen Creek Ridge stopped pretending the moment they realized I wasn't backing down. The tone of their filings changed first. Less confidence, more technical language, the kind lawyers use when they're trying to blur a line that shouldn't exist. Their attorneys submitted motions insisting the boundary shift was the result of modernized measurement standards, as if land cared about software updates. They leaned hard on the word interpretation, hoping the court would see this as a disagreement between experts rather than what it was. My attorney didn't let that framing stand for more than a page. We requested discovery immediately. Not limited documents, not summaries, full internal correspondence related to the revised survey, emails, drafts, attachments, metadata, anything involving Karen Chelsea Morton and their engineer, Ben Foster. The judge granted it without hesitation. Boundary disputes live and die on paper trails, and judges know it. The first batch of emails arrived late on a Thursday. I sat with my attorney in her office as she scrolled through them in silence, her expression tightening line by line. There it was, casual, careless, and damning. Karen questioning whether the original boundary left room for adjustment. Foster replying with options. Karen asking which version would bring the cottage under association jurisdiction. Not hypotheticals, not misunderstandings. Strategy. One message stood out. Karen wrote that if they could legally classify my cottage as encroaching, they could force compliance with HOA rules and fees. She added, almost as an afterthought, that I was alone up there and unlikely to fight a prolonged case. Reading that line, I didn't feel angry. I felt focused. People who think solitude equals weakness usually haven't met anyone who chose it. We submitted the correspondence to the court the next morning. Within hours, the judge issued an order suspending the HOA's original claim pending further review and referred the matter to a separate inquiry regarding potential fraud and professional misconduct. Aspen Creek Ridge's momentum evaporated instantly. Their lawyers asked for time. Their filings slowed. Their certainty vanished. Karen, however, didn't retreat. She released a statement to the HOA residents claiming she'd relied on expert advice and had no reason to suspect inaccuracies. That might have worked if her own emails didn't show her steering the result. Instead, it cracked something open inside the association. By the following week, I was getting calls from people who lived inside Aspen Creek Ridge. Some were cautious. Others were angry. A few admitted they'd seen boundary corrections proposed before, never finalized, never challenged. One man told me his lot line had mysteriously shifted on a map the year before, only to revert after he complained. At the time, he'd assumed it was a clerical error. Patterns have weight in court. The judge scheduled a preliminary hearing to address the discovery findings. Karen arrived looking composed, flanked by attorneys who no longer looked convinced of their own defense. When questioned, she claimed she lacked technical understanding of surveying and had trusted Foster completely. The problem was that her emails didn't reflect trust. They reflected direction. Foster was less steady. Under questioning, he admitted to modifying boundary data at the HOA's request, insisting it was within acceptable margins. When pressed about the 12-foot shift, he stopped calling it a margin. The court ordered the matter escalated. Professional licensing boards were notified. The county requested copies of all altered maps. What began as a land dispute was now officially classified as a potential case of coordinated misrepresentation. I drove back to the cottage that night, under a sky heavy with summer clouds. The building hadn't moved, the ground hadn't shifted, but the situation had. Aspen Creek Ridge had tried to quietly absorb my land into their system. Instead, they'd drawn attention to every shortcut they'd ever taken. And attention, once focused, doesn't go away. Once the discovery documents became part of the court record, Aspen Creek Ridge stopped being a single voice. It fractured. Quietly at first, then all at once. I didn't seek it out, but the calls started coming anyway. One homeowner emailed my attorney asking whether my case could affect their lot boundaries. Another wanted to know if the association had the legal right to reevaluate property lines at all. A third admitted that Karen had once suggested a boundary adjustment would increase community uniformity. No one had questioned it then. They were questioning it now. The HOA tried to regain control by calling an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, which didn't surprise me, but the outcome reached me anyway. Karen framed the lawsuit as a hostile overreaction, insisting the association was protecting its interests and that outside influence was stirring unnecessary fear. The phrase didn't land the way she wanted. Several board members asked to see the emails. She refused. 2 resigned on the spot. That same week, the judge approved a formal audit of Aspen Creek Ridge's land records as part of the ongoing inquiry. Not a friendly review. A full forensic examination of past surveys, boundary updates, and engineering certifications tied to the association. The order hit the HOA like a structural failure. Their lawyers filed objections. They were denied. Meanwhile, Karen attempted to isolate me. She had her counsel send a proposal suggesting a confidential settlement. No admission of wrongdoing. No correction of records. Just a payment offer in exchange for dropping my counterclaim and agreeing to minor structural adjustments. I read it once and laughed, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed exactly how they thought. They still believed this was about money. I declined without comment. As pressure built, the residents of Aspen Creek Ridge began organizing on their own, small groups at first, then larger ones. They wanted transparency. They wanted to know how many times boundaries had been modernized. They wanted to know who authorized Foster's work and why. Karen responded by tightening communication, limiting access to records, and issuing a statement warning against unverified claims. That was a mistake. Silence is rarely reassuring when documents exist. The first protest wasn't dramatic. A handful of residents standing outside the HOA office with printed copies of public court filings. The second was louder. By the third, local media showed up. Reporters love 2 things: property disputes and authority figures who overreach. Karen, unfortunately for herself, provided both. I stayed out of it publicly. No interviews, no statements. My attorney advised restraint, and I agreed. Let the facts speak. Let the process work. Behind the scenes, though, more residents reached out with stories. Fines imposed without explanation. Threats of compliance. Boundary clarifications that mysteriously benefited the association's common areas. When the preliminary hearing resumed, the courtroom felt different. Karen no longer looked like the person in control. She argued that the association's actions were administrative, not malicious. The judge didn't raise his voice when he disagreed. He simply cited the emails, the altered maps, and the growing list of discrepancies uncovered by the audit. By the end of the session, the court expanded the scope of the investigation. The county was now involved. So was the state licensing board overseeing engineers. Aspen Creek Ridge's legal team requested a recess. Karen didn't speak as they left the room. I drove back to the mountains that evening, the gravel crunching under my tires, the cottage appearing exactly where it always had, quiet, unchanged, patient. The land didn't care about HOAs or red lines, but people did. And the people who had trusted Karen to protect their community were starting to realize she'd been protecting something else entirely. The day of the main hearing arrived with the kind of tension you can feel before you hear it. The courthouse parking lot was fuller than I expected, and not just with lawyers' cars. Several Aspen Creek Ridge residents stood outside in small clusters, talking quietly, some holding folded signs they hadn't yet decided whether to raise. I walked past them without stopping. This wasn't a rally. This was a reckoning, and it belonged inside the courtroom. The hearing was supposed to focus on boundary evidence. It turned into something else entirely within the first hour. My attorney began by laying out the physical reality of the land. Not opinions, not theories, facts. She introduced the two independent surveyors, one after the other, and each testified separately, explaining their methods, their sources, and their conclusions. They referenced the archived plan from 1958, the original concrete markers still embedded in the soil, and the GPS data cross-checked against county records. Both reached the same conclusion without knowing the other's results. My cottage sat exactly where it always had. No encroachment, no ambiguity. Then came the comparison. The court screens displayed the HOA's updated digital map next to the authentic survey overlays. Even to an untrained eye, the difference was obvious. The boundary line didn't just drift, it jumped, 12 feet inward, clean and deliberate. My attorney asked one simple question that hung in the air longer than anything else that morning. Can a boundary move this far without physical cause or legal transfer? Both surveyors answered the same way. No. Karen's attorney objected repeatedly, arguing interpretation, modernization, human error. The judge allowed the objections, then overruled them just as quickly. Interpretation doesn't explain email instructions. Human error doesn't explain multiple drafts converging on the same advantageous outcome. When the emails were entered into evidence, the room shifted. Karen sat straighter at first, then less so as the messages were read aloud. Her own words, her phrasing, her suggestions. The line about bringing my cottage under HOA jurisdiction landed hard. The judge didn't interrupt. He let it play. Karen was called to testify. She maintained composure, claiming she relied entirely on professional guidance. She said she trusted Ben Foster's expertise. She said she never intended harm. The problem was that intent doesn't hide well when it's written down. When confronted with her messages directing boundary adjustments, she pivoted. She said she was asking questions, not issuing commands. The judge asked whether she had approved the final map. She said yes. He asked whether she had circulated it as authoritative. She said yes again. He asked whether she had used it as the basis for legal action against me. She hesitated. Ben Foster testified next. He looked smaller than I expected, like someone who had convinced himself the situation would never reach this point. Under oath, he admitted Karen had asked for revisions that would place my structure within HOA territory. He claimed he believed the shift could be justified. When asked why he didn't disclose the archived survey contradicting his work, he didn't have a convincing answer. At that point, the hearing stopped being civil. The judge paused proceedings and addressed the courtroom directly. Based on the evidence presented, he said, there was sufficient cause to believe the HOA's claim had been supported by knowingly altered documentation. He ordered the civil case formally stayed and referred the matter to the district attorney for potential criminal review. A court officer approached Karen's table and quietly asked her to stand. The sound of the room changed when the cuffs came out. Not loud, just unmistakable. Karen protested, insisting this was premature, that she hadn't been convicted of anything. The judge acknowledged that. Then he cited probable cause and the risk of further interference with records. She was escorted out through the side door. The residents outside saw it happen through the glass. The signs went up after that. I remained seated until the room emptied. There was no satisfaction in it, no relief yet. Just the steady awareness that what Aspen Creek Ridge had tried to do quietly had now become impossible to ignore. The land was still where it had always been. The truth was, too, it had just taken this long for the system to catch up. With Karen removed from the equation, Aspen Creek Ridge unraveled faster than I expected. Authority like hers doesn't disappear quietly. It leaves gaps, and gaps invite scrutiny. Within days of the hearing, the court appointed an independent administrator to oversee the association's records while the criminal investigation proceeded. The audit that had once been a threat became an inevitability. I was called back to court for the civil side less than 2 weeks later. This time, the room felt colder, more procedural. No posturing, no speeches. The HOA's legal team looked exhausted, stripped of the confidence that comes from believing you control the narrative. They requested a continuance. The judge denied it. He'd seen enough delays. My attorney presented the damages clearly and without embellishment. Legal fees, survey costs, professional time lost responding to fraudulent claims, reputational harm caused by public accusations of illegal construction. Stress imposed through the threat of forced demolition, each item tied to documentation, receipts, and expert testimony. No dramatics, just math and cause and effect. The HOA attempted to argue that Karen had acted independently. That defense didn't survive contact with their own governance documents. As president, she'd been authorized to act on behalf of the association. Her instructions to Foster had been issued using official HOA channels. The legal responsibility followed accordingly. The ruling came that afternoon. The court dismissed the HOA's original claim with prejudice. My counterclaim was upheld in part. I was awarded $180,000 in damages, payable by the association, not Karen personally. The judge cited reckless disregard for factual boundaries and intentional misuse of legal pressure. He ordered the official cadastral record restored to reflect the verified survey, permanently barring Aspen Creek Ridge from contesting my western boundary again. Then came the unexpected part. During the audit, county inspectors had discovered that a section of the HOA's infrastructure, a security fence, and a narrow paved path used by golf carts extended beyond their lawful boundary. Onto my land. Not 4 feet. More than 8. The irony didn't go unnoticed. The judge ordered the HOA to remove the encroaching structures at their own expense and restore the affected area. No negotiation, no appeal window on that directive. Compliance was mandatory. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps. I didn't stop to speak. I'd already said everything that mattered under oath. The residents of Aspen Creek Ridge watched from a distance, some relieved, others furious. A few nodded at me as I passed. Most didn't know what to do with the knowledge that their association had nearly swallowed land that wasn't theirs. Back at the cottage, the work began quietly. Survey stakes appeared along the verified line, bright against the forest floor. County officials documented everything. The HOA's contractors arrived under supervision, dismantling the fence panel by panel, cutting back asphalt, loading it away. No arguments, no grand statements, just compliance. I stood on my porch and watched the land reemerge. Soil compacted by convenience loosened again. The ground didn't remember the mistake. It only accepted correction. There was still one hearing left, the final determination of oversight and restructuring for Aspen Creek Ridge. I wasn't required to attend, but I received the notice anyway. A new board would be appointed temporarily. Financial records would be reviewed in full. All prior boundary revisions flagged for examination. For the first time since this started, the conflict stopped expanding. Not because it had burned itself out, but because there was nowhere left for it to go. The attempt had failed. The consequences were landing. And the association that once tried to redraw my land was now busy accounting for every line it had ever touched. The removal crew arrived before sunrise, their headlights cutting thin white lines through the morning fog that always settled low in the Vermont mountains. It was the kind of quiet hour when the land feels older than memory, when even sound seems reluctant to travel. Aspen Creek Ridge's trucks moved carefully, almost respectfully, as if someone had finally told them where they were allowed to exist. County officials were already waiting near the verified boundary, coffee in hand, clipboards tucked under their arms. This wasn't symbolic anymore. This was enforcement. Every post, every slab of asphalt, every inch that crossed into my parcel had to go. Documented, photographed, signed off. No shortcuts, no reinterpretations, no administrative flexibility. I watched as the first section of fence came down. The metal groaned as it was pulled free from soil that had never agreed to hold it. One of the workers muttered something about how deep the posts were set. Over-engineered, I thought. Someone had planned for permanence. They just hadn't planned for being wrong. The golf cart path took longer. The asphalt had been poured narrow and smooth, curving slightly as if to pretend it was always meant to be there. Underneath, the soil was compacted but alive. When the last strip was removed, the ground breathed again. It sounds dramatic, but anyone who works with land knows what disturbed earth feels like when it's finally allowed to rest. A county surveyor walked the line with me one final time. We moved marker to marker, confirming coordinates against the official record now permanently restored. He didn't rush. He didn't editorialize. When he reached the last point, he nodded once and made a note. That was it. The line existed again, not as an argument, but as fact. By mid-afternoon, Aspen Creek Ridge's presence on my property was gone. The trucks rolled out quietly, one by one. No speeches, no final looks, just compliance. The kind that comes after confidence has been legally dismantled. The next morning, I installed the sign. I chose the spot carefully, near the boundary but not aggressive, visible from the slope where the HOA's houses cut geometric shapes into the forest. The words were simple, painted cleanly. This land was always mine, not a threat, not a warning. A statement of record. The fallout moved faster after that. Karen Chelsea Morton's criminal case accelerated once investigators expanded their scope. The emails that surfaced during discovery weren't isolated. They were a template. Similar language appeared in correspondence involving other parcels, other adjustments, other homeowners who had never realized their boundaries had briefly existed somewhere else on a screen. The charges multiplied: fraud, attempted unlawful appropriation of land, falsification of records. Bail conditions tightened. Then they vanished entirely. Karen was taken into custody again, this time without ceremony. Aspen Creek Ridge scrambled to survive its own exposure. The court-appointed administrator froze discretionary spending and opened the books fully. Residents learned how much money had been funneled into legal pressure campaigns instead of maintenance, how many fines had been issued based on questionable authority, how often the phrase boundary clarification had appeared without any county involvement. Anger replaced embarrassment. Trust evaporated. Emergency elections followed, supervised and painfully formal. The new board's first act was a public apology drafted with surgical caution. They acknowledged wrongdoing without naming names. They promised audits, transparency, cooperation. The county accepted the apology conditionally. Residents accepted it with crossed arms. I stayed out of it. I had no interest in becoming a symbol or a spokesperson. I wanted my land quiet again. I wanted the cottage to go back to being just a place, not a case study. The compensation arrived exactly on schedule. $180,000 transferred cleanly, accompanied by a court order that read like a door permanently closing. Boundaries confirmed, claims barred, records locked. I filed the documents away, not triumphantly, but carefully. Land deserves that kind of respect. As summer leaned toward fall, the forest reclaimed what had been disturbed. I worked the soil where the asphalt had been, reseeding native grass, restoring the slope to its original contour. It didn't take long. The land remembered itself. It always does. One evening, as the light dropped behind the ridge, I walked the perimeter alone. No tape measures, no stakes, just memory and ground. I thought about my grandfather, how he'd bought this place after the war, how he'd built the cottage with his own hands, how he'd trusted the boundaries because they'd been measured honestly. I understood then that this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about refusing to let convenience erase history. Aspen Creek Ridge still existed beyond the trees, still manicured, still convinced of its own value. But it no longer reached where it didn't belong. Not here, not again. I closed the cottage door behind me as night settled in, the mountains steady and indifferent to paperwork, but deeply responsive to truth.